There was a time when marriage vows meant something sacred. But what happened on Family Feud in September 2024 would test the very definition of loyalty and forgiveness. When Margaret Chen walked onto that stage with her husband David beside her, nobody knew she was carrying evidence of his betrayal in her pocket. What Steve Harvey witnessed that day would leave him speechless and force him to make a decision that went against every game show protocol. This is a story about trust, public humiliation, and why sometimes the most painful truths need to be spoken out loud. Before we begin, if you appreciate stories about real human courage and moral complexity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Margaret Chen was 52 years old, a high school English teacher from Sacramento, California, who had dedicated 28 years of her life to her marriage with David Chen. For more than 2 decades, Margaret had been the kind of wife who packed lunches every morning, attended every work function, and built her entire world around supporting her husband's career as a commercial real estate developer. Her 3 children, now adults with families of their own, had grown up watching their mother demonstrate unwavering devotion to family values. David Chen, at 55, had built a successful career that provided comfortable living for his family. He was known in their community as a respected businessman, a deacon at their church, and a man who spoke frequently about the importance of traditional family values. To the outside world, the Chens represented everything that a stable, successful marriage should look like. They attended the same church for 23 years. They hosted neighborhood barbecues. They were the couple that others aspired to emulate. But 3 months before their Family Feud appearance, Margaret had discovered something that shattered the foundation of everything she believed about her marriage. While doing laundry, she had found a phone hidden in David's gym bag. It was a second phone she never knew existed. When she opened it, what she discovered made her physically ill. Hundreds of text messages between David and his assistant, a woman named Jessica who was 15 years younger than Margaret, revealed an affair that had been ongoing for 2 years. The messages were not just evidence of physical betrayal. They contained mockery of Margaret herself. David had written to Jessica about how his wife had let herself go and how he found her boring and predictable. He complained about having to attend family dinners and church services when he would rather be with Jessica. The cruelty of the words cut deeper than the infidelity itself. Margaret had confronted David immediately. His response followed a predictable pattern of denial, anger, and eventual minimal admission. He claimed the affair was over, that it had been a mistake, and that he wanted to work on their marriage. He begged her not to tell their children or anyone in their community. He promised to attend counseling. He said all the right words, but Margaret noticed he never actually apologized. He never took genuine responsibility. He simply wanted the problem to disappear. What David did not know was that Margaret had made copies of everything on that phone. She had screenshots of every message, every photo, every piece of evidence of his double life. She had not decided what to do with this information, but some instinct told her to preserve it. 2 weeks after the confrontation, their youngest daughter, Emily, called with exciting news. Emily had applied for her parents to appear on Family Feud as part of an extended family team competition. They had been selected. The taping would be in 6 weeks. Emily was thrilled because she knew how much her mother loved game shows, particularly Family Feud. It would be a fun family bonding experience, she said. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. How could she stand on stage pretending to be part of a happy family when her marriage was a lie? But then something shifted in her thinking. She had spent 28 years being the dutiful wife, the woman who made everyone else comfortable, the person who absorbed pain silently to keep the peace. For the first time in her life, Margaret wondered what would happen if she stopped protecting David from the consequences of his choices. She agreed to do the show. David, desperate to maintain the appearance of normalcy and terrified that Margaret might expose him, enthusiastically supported the idea. He saw it as a sign that she was moving past the affair, that they could return to their comfortable facade. He had no idea what Margaret was planning. The taping day arrived on a bright Thursday morning in Los Angeles. The Chen family team consisted of Margaret and David, their daughter Emily, Emily's husband Marcus, and David's younger brother Robert. They were competing against the Patterson family from Atlanta in what was scheduled to be a standard, entertaining episode of Family Feud. Steve Harvey greeted both families with his characteristic warmth and humor. He went down the line introducing each family member, asking the usual lighthearted questions about their lives and what made their family special. When he reached Margaret, he asked her what she loved most about being married to David. Margaret smiled, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and said clearly into the microphone that she loved David's commitment to traditional values. The audience applauded politely. Steve moved on, not detecting the undercurrent of tension in her response. David stood beside her, his hand possessively on her shoulder, playing the role of devoted husband perfectly. Game progressed normally through the first few rounds. The Chen family was performing well, their teamwork and quick responses putting them ahead of the Patterson family. Emily was delighted, bouncing with excitement each time their family scored points. David was in his element, enjoying the attention and the opportunity to showcase his quick wit. Robert was supportive, cheering loudly for each correct answer. Marcus, Emily's husband, was perhaps the only one who seemed to sense something was off with Margaret. He had noticed her unusual quietness, the way she kept touching her jacket pocket. During a commercial break, Steve Harvey walked over to chat with the families as he often did. He approached Margaret directly and commented on how calm she seemed compared to most contestants. Margaret looked him directly in the eyes and said something that made him pause. She told him that she had learned over the years that the most important moments in life require absolute clarity and courage. Steve nodded, slightly puzzled by the depth of the response to his casual observation, but the break ended before he could pursue the conversation further. The game continued. The Chen family won the main rounds and advanced to fast money. The family huddled together to decide who would play. Traditionally, the strongest players would compete in this final round for the $20,000 prize. Emily volunteered to go first, and the family agreed. For the second player, David immediately stepped forward, assuming it would be him. He had been the top scorer during the main game, but Margaret spoke up. Her voice was steady and clear. She said she would like to play fast money. David looked surprised but nodded, not wanting to create tension on camera. The family agreed, attributing Margaret's request to her love of the show. Steve Harvey asked if they were sure about their lineup, and the family confirmed. Emily went first in fast money, scoring a respectable 138 points. The family erupted in celebration. They needed only 62 more points to win. Steve brought Margaret to the soundproof booth while Emily's answers were revealed. David stood with the family, confident and relaxed. He had no reason to believe anything unusual was about to happen. Margaret stood at the podium, her hands resting on the surface, her expression composed. Steve reviewed the rules, asked if she was ready and prepared to begin. Margaret nodded. The clock started. Steve asked the first question about naming a reason someone might change their phone number. Margaret answered clearly. The next 3 questions followed in quick succession, and Margaret provided answers without hesitation. Then came the 5th and final question. Steve asked to name something people keep hidden from their spouse. Margaret paused. The silence stretched for just a moment too long. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out several folded pieces of paper. Steve Harvey's expression shifted from his usual playful encouragement to confusion. This was not part of the normal game show flow. Margaret unfolded the papers and looked directly at the camera. Then she looked at David, who was standing off stage with the family, his face suddenly pale as he realized what she was holding. Margaret began to read. Her voice was steady, clear, and completely calm. She read text messages from David to Jessica. She read his complaints about their marriage. She read his descriptions of intimate moments with his mistress. She read his mockery of the life they had built together. Each word landed in the studio like a physical blow. The audience sat in stunned silence. Emily's hand flew to her mouth in horror. Robert looked at his brother with disgust. Marcus wrapped his arm around his wife as she began to cry. David stood frozen, unable to move or speak. And Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of episodes and thought he had seen everything, stood with the microphone in his hand, genuinely at a loss for words. Margaret continued reading. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply presented the evidence of her husband's betrayal with the same careful attention to detail she used when teaching her students about literary analysis. When she finished reading the last message, she folded the papers and placed them back in her pocket. Then she looked at Steve Harvey and said that people keep affairs hidden from their spouses, and that was her answer to question 5. The studio was absolutely silent. The producers in the booth did not know whether to cut to commercial, stop the taping, or let the moment continue. Steve Harvey made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of the episode. Instead of trying to smooth over the situation or redirect to the game, he set down his cards and walked over to Margaret. Steve Harvey spoke quietly at first, asking Margaret if she was okay. She nodded and said she had never been more clear-headed in her life. Steve then did something unprecedented. He asked the director to stop the clock. He turned to the audience and explained that what they were witnessing was not part of any planned segment. This was a real woman dealing with real pain in a very public way. He asked Margaret why she had chosen this moment, this platform, to reveal her husband's infidelity. Margaret's answer was simple and devastating. She explained that she had spent 28 years making herself smaller to make David comfortable. She had absorbed his criticisms, managed his moods, and built her identity around being his wife. When she discovered his affair, her first instinct had been to hide it, to protect him from embarrassment, to keep their family's image intact. But then she realized that this pattern of protection was exactly what had enabled his behavior. Margaret told Steve and the audience that she had tried to handle the situation privately. She had confronted David. She had suggested counseling, but David's response had made it clear that he was not sorry for hurting her. He was only sorry for being caught. His primary concern was maintaining his reputation and avoiding consequences. In that moment, Margaret understood that protecting his image was actually preventing any possibility of real change or accountability. She explained that she chose Family Feud specifically because David cared so much about how others perceived him. He was willing to pretend everything was fine and stand on stage as a devoted husband because he valued the appearance of success more than the reality of his marriage. Margaret decided that if he could use a public platform to maintain his facade, she could use the same platform to reveal the truth. Steve Harvey listened without interrupting. Then he turned to David, who was still standing off stage with the family. Steve invited him to come to the podium. David hesitated, clearly wanting to refuse, but the cameras were on him and refusing would look even worse than facing the situation. He walked slowly to the stage, his face a mixture of anger, humiliation, and shock. Steve asked David if what Margaret had read was true. David's response was telling. He did not deny the affair. Instead, he immediately tried to deflect and minimize. He said that marriage was complicated, that Margaret was not innocent either, that she did not understand the pressure he was under. He never actually apologized. He never took responsibility. His primary concern, even in this moment of public exposure, was managing his own image and shifting blame. Margaret stood quietly while David spoke. When he finished his deflections, she said something that stopped him cold. She told him that she had given him every opportunity to own his behavior privately. She had offered him the chance to go to counseling, to have honest conversations, to actually work on their marriage. But he had chosen to minimize, blame, and demand that she move past it without him doing any real work of accountability or change. This public revelation was not revenge, she said. It was the logical consequence of his refusal to address the situation honestly. Steve Harvey then made a decision that would be debated in media circles for weeks afterward. He announced that they would take a break from the game show format entirely. He invited both families to sit down, and he facilitated what essentially became a family intervention on national television. Emily was devastated, sobbing as she processed the betrayal of the father she had idealized. Robert confronted his brother about the hypocrisy of speaking about family values at church while conducting an affair. Marcus asked David directly how he could justify the cruelty of his text messages. The Patterson family, the competing team, sat quietly witnessing this raw family moment, several of them wiping away tears. Throughout this entire confrontation, Margaret remained remarkably composed. She was not cruel or vindictive. She simply held firm in her truth and refused to protect David from the natural consequences of his choices. When Emily asked her mother why she had not told the children privately, Margaret explained that David had specifically asked her to keep the affair secret from their children to protect his relationship with them. Margaret realized that this request was not about protecting the children, but about protecting himself. She decided that her children, all adults, deserved to know the truth about their father, even if that truth was painful. Steve Harvey, processing all of this in real time, spoke about the complexity of marriage, the importance of accountability, and the courage it takes to speak difficult truths. He acknowledged that what Margaret had done was unconventional and would be controversial, but he also said something that resonated deeply with the audience. He said that sometimes protecting someone from embarrassment is the same as enabling their harmful behavior. Sometimes love requires letting natural consequences occur. He turned to David and asked him directly what he intended to do now. Would he finally take responsibility? Would he seek help? Would he do the actual work required to understand why he had made these choices? David's response was evasive and self-focused. He talked about being humiliated, about his career being damaged, about how this public exposure was cruel and unfair. He still did not apologize to Margaret. He still did not take genuine responsibility. Steve Harvey looked at Margaret with something approaching admiration. He told her that what she had done took extraordinary courage. He acknowledged that some people would judge her for choosing such a public forum for such a private pain, but he also said that he understood why she had done it. David had left her no choice by refusing to address the situation honestly in private. The episode that aired 6 weeks later became one of the most watched and discussed in Family Feud history. The producers made the decision to air the entire confrontation with minimal editing, including a disclaimer at the beginning explaining that what viewers were about to see was an unscripted moment of real family conflict. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Public opinion was deeply divided. Many people praised Margaret for her courage and for refusing to protect her husband from the consequences of his behavior. They saw her actions as a powerful statement about accountability and the importance of speaking truth even when it is uncomfortable. Domestic counselors and therapists noted that Margaret's calm, clear presentation of facts without hysteria or violence was actually a healthy way of addressing betrayal compared to the silent suffering that many people endure. Others criticized her for airing private matters publicly and for humiliating David on national television. They argued that family conflicts should be handled privately and that her actions were vindictive rather than constructive. Some suggested that she had damaged her children's relationship with their father unnecessarily. Steve Harvey addressed the controversy on his talk show 2 weeks after the episode aired. He explained his decision to let the moment play out rather than cutting to commercial or stopping the taping. He said that as a host, he had a responsibility to honor authentic human moments even when they were uncomfortable. He noted that Family Feud had always been about families and real relationships, and what happened with the Chen family was perhaps the realest moment the show had ever captured. Margaret herself became an unexpected spokesperson for women dealing with infidelity. She appeared on several talk shows and podcasts, not to discuss the details of David's affair, but to talk about the broader issues of accountability in relationships and the importance of women not sacrificing their truth to maintain comfortable facades. She emphasized that her goal had never been to destroy David, but to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. She explained in interviews that the decision to reveal the affair publicly had been agonizing. She had spent weeks considering whether it was the right thing to do. What ultimately convinced her was the realization that David's primary concern was his reputation rather than the harm he had caused. She understood that as long as she was willing to keep his secret, he would never have to truly confront what he had done. The public exposure forced a reckoning that private conversations had failed to achieve. The impact on the Chen family was complicated and painful. Emily initially struggled with anger toward her mother for the public revelation, feeling that it had robbed her of the ability to process her father's betrayal privately. But after several months, and with the help of therapy, Emily came to understand her mother's perspective. She realized that she had been angry at her mother for being the messenger rather than being angry at her father for his actual betrayal. This realization led to a slow reconciliation between mother and daughter. David and Margaret separated 3 months after the episode aired. David continued to maintain that Margaret's public revelation was an act of cruelty that made reconciliation impossible. He positioned himself as the victim of public humiliation rather than the perpetrator of private betrayal. This response confirmed for Margaret that she had made the right decision. Even when faced with undeniable consequences, David remained unable or unwilling to take genuine responsibility. The divorce proceedings revealed additional affairs beyond the one with Jessica. David had established a pattern of infidelity throughout much of their marriage, always carefully compartmentalized and hidden. The discovery of this pattern brought Margaret a strange sense of relief. She realized that she had not failed as a wife. David's behavior was not a response to any deficiency in her. It was a pattern of choice that predated their marriage issues. 1 year after the Family Feud episode, Margaret published a memoir titled The Courage to be Uncomfortable. The book was not primarily about David's affair, but about her journey from being someone who made herself small to maintain peace to becoming someone who could speak difficult truths, even when they created conflict. The book resonated with thousands of women who saw their own experiences reflected in Margaret's story. Steve Harvey wrote the foreword to Margaret's book. In it, he reflected on how that moment on Family Feud had changed his own understanding of courage and truth-telling. He wrote about how easy it is to praise courage in the abstract while condemning it when it appears in forms that make us uncomfortable. He acknowledged that what Margaret did was uncomfortable for everyone who witnessed it, but that discomfort was precisely the point. Real accountability often requires discomfort. The episode sparked broader conversations about infidelity, public shaming, and accountability in relationships. Marriage therapists debated whether public confrontation could ever be therapeutic or whether it inevitably caused more harm than healing. Some argued that Margaret's approach was vindictive and counterproductive. Others contended that traditional private methods of addressing infidelity often protect the unfaithful partner while leaving the betrayed partner silenced and isolated. What became clear through these conversations was that there were no simple answers. Margaret's choice to reveal David's affair publicly was neither purely right nor purely wrong. It was a complex decision made by a woman who had exhausted private options and who understood that sometimes the only way to force accountability is to remove the protective cover of secrecy. 3 years after the episode aired, Margaret had built a new life. She continued teaching, finding renewed purpose in her work with students. She became an advocate for honest conversations about marriage and relationships, speaking at women's conferences about the importance of maintaining identity and voice within partnerships. She dated occasionally, but was in no rush to remarry, having discovered a contentment in independence that she had never experienced during her marriage. David remarried 2 years after the divorce to a woman he met through work. He never publicly acknowledged responsibility for the affair or for the breakdown of his marriage. He maintained his position that Margaret's public revelation had been an act of unforgivable cruelty. His relationship with his children remained strained, with Emily maintaining minimal contact and choosing not to invite him to her own wedding. The Family Feud episode remained a cultural touchstone, referenced in articles about infidelity, accountability, and public confrontation. It was studied in communications classes as an example of how authentic moments can break through scripted media formats. It was debated in ethics classes about the boundaries between public and private information. For Margaret, the most meaningful impact was personal rather than public. She had spent decades defining herself through her role as wife and mother, absorbing criticism and making herself smaller to avoid conflict. The decision to speak truth publicly, despite the judgment and controversy it created, marked a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and her right to take up space in the world. In interviews years later, Margaret was often asked if she regretted choosing such a public forum for such a private revelation. Her answer evolved over time, but ultimately settled on a nuanced truth. She said that she did not regret forcing accountability, but she acknowledged the cost of doing it publicly. Her children had been hurt by the public nature of the revelation. Her own life had been disrupted by sudden notoriety. The controversy and judgment had been exhausting, but she also said that private confrontation had failed completely. David had demonstrated clearly that he would not choose accountability unless forced by consequences he could not avoid. The public revelation created consequences that finally matched the severity of his betrayal. It also gave voice to her pain in a way that private suffering never could. The story of what happened on Family Feud that day ultimately became a story about the complexity of truth-telling, the messiness of real accountability, and the courage it takes to speak when silence would be easier. Margaret Chen became a symbol of something difficult and uncomfortable. The reality that sometimes doing the right thing does not feel good and does not lead to neat resolutions. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you think about courage and truth and the complicated nature of relationships, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that remind us that real life is rarely simple, that moral clarity is hard-won, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is speak truth, even when our voices shake. The studio audience that day witnessed something they would never forget. They saw a woman refuse to protect someone from the natural consequences of their choices. They saw a husband unable to take responsibility even when confronted with undeniable evidence. They saw a family fracture in real time, and they saw Steve Harvey navigate an impossible situation with surprising grace and wisdom. What happened on Family Feud was not entertainment in the traditional sense. It was a real human moment captured on camera, messy and painful and unresolved. It was a reminder that beneath every game show contestant, every smiling family photo, every appearance of perfection, there are real people dealing with real pain and making complicated choices about how to survive betrayal and reclaim their truth. Margaret Chen did not win the $20,000 that day. The game never resumed after her revelation. But she gained something more valuable, the certainty that she had finally stopped making herself small to make someone else comfortable. And for a woman who had spent 28 years absorbing pain silently, that was victory enough.